know we're facing some challenges ahead of us, and I know more than anything, it can feel uncomfortable to sort of be heading into the unknown. I will be honest, I don't know that tonight you're going to leave with very firm knowledge of anything, because the truth is everything remains very much in the unknown. But I have tried to put together some ideas and guidance in terms of the last administration and in terms of what has been said pretty publicly by Trump himself regarding his plans for immigration. And some of it may not apply to your lives and some of it will, but I think just kind of having that knowledge out there will be helpful for everyone. So I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and get that started and share my screen. Just bear with me while I make that arrangement. Oh, actually, it says that I cannot share my screen. It says it's been disabled.
How about now?
Ha ha ha, we are in good shape. All right.
Okay.
So here we go. All right. Okay, okay, great. So that's the presentation that we're doing. So today I'm going to sort of introduce myself, go through some potential policy changes, talk about what definitely is something that I know is on the agenda for the Trump administration, which is increased enforcement. And then we'll talk a little bit about what rights you have and things that you can do should you get in a situation where you are in contact with law enforcement and feel unsafe in that circumstance. First, something that Trump has talked a lot about is his intention to end TPS. He previously indicated he wanted to end DACA. He sort of waffled on that a bit, so it's unclear what his intentions will be on the DACA front. He's sort of taken a different stance of late. He may go back and try and end it again. So in the last administration, basically he tried to end the DACA program. Lawsuits were filed and that prevented the end of the DACA program. That said, the Supreme Court is different now. The makeup of the courts are quite different now. And so it's really difficult to say whether or not he will be successful in ending DACA if he does try to go forward with that. Conversely, he's also talked about creating other programs for DACA recipients. So it may be that he ends DACA and creates other pathways, or it may be that he doesn't touch DACA at all. Conversely, he's been pretty strong and clear and consistent about his desire to end TPS for a significant number of the designated countries. In terms of potential success, again, I can't tell you whether or not he will be successful, simply because it will depend on the mechanism through which he tries to end TPS programs and then the lawsuits that ensue from that. And then also from there, which courts and which judges are hearing those lawsuits. But TPS is very potentially going to face some challenges during the Trump administration. I highly recommend that anybody who currently is only holding TPS status to seek a travel document if you do not have a legal entry into the United States, or if you have any period of time where you were here not in a lawful status. Traveling on administrative or an advanced parole will give you a lawful status and potentially open up pathways, a lawful entry, which will potentially open up pathways to other statuses in the future, should TPS become not an option. Highly recommend that you consult with an immigration attorney if you're curious about what opportunities you may have to adjust to a different status or to change status from TPS to something else. Something that we do anticipate and know is that there will be expanded interior enforcement. And so what does that mean? That means more people will be placed into removal proceedings and more people will be detained. So, you know, President-elect Trump has been very clear that he wants to deport 1 million people. I think he said 1 million people on his first day in office. I think that that's probably entirely unrealistic. That said, I think 1 million people over the course of, a year is probably potentially doable. It's unclear at this time how that will look in reality. He has talked about declaring a national emergency and using the military in order to help effectuate those deportations. It's important to remember that the US government cannot deport someone unless they have a judge has ordered them deported at some point, as long as they're already inside the United States. So there's some deportation without seeing a judge at the US border. So those would be people coming into the United States. But once you're already physically inside the United States, you cannot be removed from the United States without seeing a judge and being ordered deported, okay? So it's very likely that, at least initially, to get their deportation numbers up, the Trump administration would focus on people who already have outstanding removal orders. And if you're wondering why I'm using removal versus deportation, the legal term is removal, but a removal order and a deportation order is the exact same thing. So they'll likely focus on people who already have removal orders within the United States. So those are people who perhaps missed a hearing at some point, or perhaps they have an outstanding removal order that simply hasn't been effectuated by the government at this point for various reasons. Several people, many people were not removed during the pandemic because countries were not accepting people because of travel document issues. So there's a lot of people in the United States right now who have outstanding orders of removal. Additionally, some crimes make someone essentially automatically removable from the United States, though they do have the chance to go see a judge. So that would be the other circumstance the Trump administration would want to seek removal of those people and try to effectuate their removals. So I think that's where they will initially focus. Depending on how efficient and effective they are at removing those people, they will then turn their attention to finding and locating people who don't have outstanding removal orders, but are removable from the United States. And that is simply people who are living within the United States who are undocumented. That would include both people who have arrived on a visa and overstayed it, and also people who have come across the southern border, did not have contact with immigration officials, and have remained in the United States. In terms of how they will go about finding those people, they have a lot of avenues to do it, including programs where they have tried to get cities and, more importantly, police stations to deputize them to investigate potential immigration violations. And Mohammed, I do see your hand is up, and I'm going to just go through this, and I will take questions at the end. But I just want to acknowledge that I see you, and I'll take your question first. In some states and in some municipalities, counties, and cities, the U.S. federal government has deputized local law enforcement to investigate potential immigration violations. And so that is one way, one avenue for them to increase internal enforcement. Additionally, this is a big change from the Biden administration. So the Biden administration focused most heavily on recent arrivals to the United States and people with dangerous criminal histories in determining whether or not to place them in removal proceedings, and also whether or not to detain them. However, the Trump administration in its previous iteration did away with any concept of a priority. Any person who was living in the United States who was undocumented was considered a priority in the previous administration. And I do anticipate the same stance being taken in this administration. Additionally, in the last year of the Biden administration, so in this last year, we've seen a huge uptick in enforcement and detention. And so I imagine that trend will continue under the Trump administration. Specifically in this area, we saw a real decrease in detention over the last few years because a Farmville Detention Center in Virginia was all but shut down. It had very limited bed space due to major problems during the COVID pandemic. And all detention centers in Maryland were shut down. But Farmville is now open and able to go to complete capacity. And so we have seen a significant uptick in detention of late. And there are significant plans already in place for additional detention centers to open within the United States. So I do think that detention will be a priority of the Trump administration and something they will seek. In the past, anybody in TPS status was essentially not going to be in detention. They were there was a memo out that said that the government would not detain people in TPS status. That memo has been revoked by the previous Trump administration. That said, someone just living their lives in valid TPS status is unlikely to be detained. It would have to be a circumstance where the person has an outstanding removal order or has committed some kind of new crime that would get them into detention. And whereas in the past they would not have been detained, they would be detained moving forward. Detention is not the same as deportation, I should mention. Many people are detained, able to request a bond from an immigration judge, and they are able to leave detention and continue their removal case before the immigration court and file for relief. And some people fight their cases detained and are successful in fighting those cases and leave detention with a more firm status. So detention is not removal. I just want to be clear about that, though I wish it on no one. This does not really apply to anybody currently in the United States, but I think it's also very likely that Trump will reenact the Remain in Mexico policy. He has stated that he has the intention of doing so, and this is a policy that would require recent arrivals to remain in Mexico while they underwent removal proceedings seeking asylum in the United States. More than anything, it's very likely that we will see significant delays in the processing of applications. Under the prior Trump administration, we saw really, truly very slow processing times for many applications. Specifically, Trump made a requirement that essentially all USCIS applications required an interview. And so while right now, many applications that are filed before USCIS do not require an interview, such as, I'm an adult and I'm filing for a family petition for my child. That typically doesn't get an interview. Under the Trump administration's previous policy, that would get an interview. And so if everyone is required to have an interview, the processing times will be delayed. We also saw significant cuts to USCIS staffing during the prior administration, which impacted adjudication times. And so that's another aspect of the Trump administration plan of sort of delaying your access to any applications you may be eligible for. So those are a few of the changes. I think some other changes are more specific to the context of removal proceedings, which would be limiting access to forms of relief within removal proceedings and limiting access to continuances which is what we saw in the prior administration. Um, to be honest, I think overall the Trump administration's goal will be to disrupt immigration and organize immigration processes on every level they possibly can. That's sort of been the prior MO for the Trump administration. That being said, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no hope or no pathways to maintain the status in the United States. There are laws in place for immigration, and absolutely the pathways are there. It just might be a longer wait or a more challenging process. Lastly, um, he may reinstate very strict restrictions related to demonstrating your ability to support yourself and that you are not a public charge. Which we also saw in the prior Trump administration, which just requires significant financial disclosures at any time when you're applying for lawful permanent residency in the United States. So what can we do, right? So I highly recommend that everyone stay informed. The thing about the Trump administration that is most challenging is that things happen quickly and they happen without a lot of notice. So often it is a tweet from Trump himself letting us know what a new policy is or what a new agenda item is for him. So stay informed, but depend on a reliable source of information. So the internet is full of people who will tell you that the world is going to work this way, or that immigration is this way or that way. And some people have really great information and some people don't. So always check the information if someone is saying it, make sure there are other reliable sources that are saying the same thing. At the end of the day, always consult with an immigration attorney before you assume something is correct. And continue to seek opportunities to normalize your status if you're not in a safe status. So because the internal enforcement priorities are likely to increase, that means that there is a higher likelihood that people who are just living their lives may come in contact with law enforcement who are interested in them because of their immigration status rather than because of them breaking the law. So, if you are stopped by the police, it's good to remember that you do have the right to remain silent. And if you want to exercise that right, you can say, I am going to exercise my right to remain silent. Regardless of your immigration status in the United States, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to refuse a search of yourself or your car or your home. So if an officer does not have a warrant, they do not have the right to search you. They can pat you down to look for dangerous weapons, but they do not have the right to search you, your car, or your home. You might be wondering, why would I stay silent and why would I refuse a search? If you have an immigration status in the United States that's firm, maybe you don't feel the need to stay silent. But if your immigration status is, I have a pending affirmative application, but I have overstayed a visa, or I have a pending affirmative application, but I'm currently not in a status, it might make sense to stay quiet because even with an affirmative application, the government can choose to detain you and place you in removal proceedings. I saw that a lot in the Trump administration. Someone would have an affirmative asylum application, they would have contact with law enforcement, and then the Trump administration would put them into removal proceedings. So instead of having an affirmative asylum application, it's now a defensive asylum application. To be clear, the person still got to apply for asylum. Their applications were adjudicated. It just was adjudicated in a different context. So how much you want to say and how much you don't want to say really will depend on how much risk you face in saying the truth to an officer. If you are arrested, you have the right to an attorney, and you should immediately ask for one. And remember that you have constitutional rights regardless of your citizenship status. So here are just some recommendations. If you do end up having contact with ICE, stay calm. You know, no one is looking, most people are not looking to hurt anyone or harm them. They're looking to do their jobs. So stay calm, don't run, don't get in an argument with someone. You know, clarify whether you're being detained or not. Ask if you're free to leave. If you're free to leave, then leave. If you're not, then you're under arrest, and then you have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to an attorney, and you should express your desire to speak to an attorney. So that is my presentation. I feel like there will be a lot of questions. And I just want to say these are some highlights of policy changes. I think that the potential policy changes are inexhaustible, and I could probably spend 24 hours talking about potential policy changes. I tried to pick out some policy changes that were most relevant to people who are currently inside the United States, but I'm happy to go over any questions.